Okay, so we left Abram, remember at the end last time, he had just gone off to fight a bunch of kings and get his nephew back, which seemed to be a pretty courageous act. And so that brought a story to an end. And it's interesting. I think what happens in the narrative is that there's a story. So Abraham is somewhere and he goes somewhere else, right? That's a story. And he has adventures along the way. And those adventures are usually the typical kind of adventure, which is a rift in the structure of the story, an exposure to a kind of chaos and novelty, and then a reconstitution of the mode of being. So that's a classic story, right? You are somewhere, you're a certain way, you're moving forward, something happens that you don't expect, it blows you into pieces, it introduces chaos, right? You face the dragon, you get the gold, or maybe the bloody thing eats you and the story is over. And then you get to where you're going. But then the question is, well, what happens when you get to where you're going? And that's a really important issue, because one of the things that happens to people all the time in their life is that they get to where they're going and then they don't know what to do, right? So, for example, you graduate from university. It's like, okay, story over. Who are you now? Who are you the next day? And so what happens is when you succeed, then there's a success crisis. And the success crisis is, well, I've run this story to its end. Now what? And that's exactly what happens in the Abrahamic stories. And they're punctuated by a period of contemplation and sacrifice. So every time an Abrahamic story comes to its end, then Abraham makes another sacrifice and communes with God, and then he figures out what to do next. And that seems right. It seems psychologically right, because what you should do when your story comes to an end, when you've achieved what it is that you want to achieve, or perhaps when you're in terribly dire straits, but we won't talk about that at the moment. When you've achieved what you need to achieve, then the next question is, okay, well, now I'm that person, or I have that character. What do I need to do next? And some of that is always, well, what do I need to give up now? What do I need to let go of so I can move to the next plateau, right? Assuming that your life is hopefully a sequence of upward moving, what would you call them? It's like Sisyphus, except you're actually, each time you climb up the mountain, you get a little higher on the mountain. It's something like that. So it's Sisyphus with an optimistic bent. And maybe if you push the rock up the mountain properly and let it roll down, then, and if you do that right, then it's okay. Every time you roll it back up, it's better in some sense. I don't think that's unrealistic either. And so Abraham goes and rescues his nephew from these tyrannical kings. That's very brave, and he doesn't take any reward for it, because as far as he's concerned, it's just a manifestation of the right thing. And then he has another vision. After these things, that's the battle, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, no one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and he said, Now look to heaven, and tell the stars, if you're able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And Abram believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give this land to you to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And then he does this sacrifice. Take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat, and a ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And then God comes down, and, well, Abraham goes into a trance. That's what it appears to be in the story, and has a great terror, and then God appears to him. And I'll just review this commentary again. This is from Joseph Benson. And when the sun was going down, that's about the time when you wash up for the evening, and he's praying and waiting towards evening. A deep sleep fell upon Abraham, not a common sleep through weariness or carelessness, but a divine ecstasy, that being wholly taken off from things sensible, he might be wholly taken up with the contemplation of things spiritual. Very strange, very, very strange series of interpretations, because it does seem that what happens to Abraham, that he falls into some sort of revelatory trance. And so, as I've taken some pains to explain, we don't really understand such things, and we can't rule out their existence because there's too much evidence that they do in fact occur. Perhaps it's a technology that we no longer possess. That's one possibility. Perhaps we no longer know how to access these sorts of states of consciousness. It's certainly possible. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. This was designed to strike awe upon the spirit of Abram and to possess him with holy reverence. Holy fear prepares the soul for holy joy. God humbles first and then lifts up. Yeah, well, I think that's right too. Like, you know, one of the experiences I've had in my life, fairly commonly, in a variety of different ways, this is especially true when I was paying a lot of attention to my dreams, which I did for about 15 years, I guess, something like that. Now and then I would feel like I'd learned some things and had sort of consolidated them, and then before I went to sleep, I'd think, okay, I'm ready to learn something else. It's like, and I didn't say that without trepidation, and because usually when you learn something, you know, it's not that pleasant, because you usually learn something about why you're wrong. And the deeper the thing that you learn, the more you learn about why you're wrong. And there's a death that's associated with that, because then you have to let that part of you that's wrong die, and that's the sacrifice, right? And so you have to make a sacrifice. You have to be willing to make a sacrifice before you're going to learn something, and perhaps what you'll learn is in proportion to your willingness to make a sacrifice. And I really do believe that. I do believe that as well, because I also think that if you commit to something, that means that you don't do a bunch of other things, right? So that's the sacrifice of all those other things. You commit to it and you set your sights on it. If you really commit to it and you get the sacrifice right, so to speak, then the probability that that thing will be successful vastly increases. And I think that that's also not a naive or a naive way of thinking or a foolish way of thinking. My experience has been that that's the case. And so, back to the dream, I mean, I do think that we learn in trepidation, and that most of the time, if you have to be laid low before the new revelation can make itself manifest. And I think that's also what happens to people often in psychedelic experiences when they have a bad trip, is they don't get through the bad part of it. And maybe that's because there's so much mess in their lives. Now, I'm speculating, but it's informed speculation. There's so much mess in their lives that the altered state of consciousness makes manifest that it's like a little trip through hell, but the mess is so complete and comprehensive and all-pervading that there's no way they can get through it. Now, if they could get through it and started to sort those things out, then, you know, there would be perhaps what would you call it? A compensatory positive revelation at the end. But the first thing is, if you want to learn something, is that you're going to encounter, well, you have to figure out what's wrong before you can figure out what wisdom you need next to guide yourself. And that's no laughing matter, right? And so I think that that's what this refers to. I think that's the sort of psychological experience that refers to.